Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is part two of what actually happened on the 3rd of March, 1924. And a big welcome back to Dr. Abdul Wahid for your second presentation today. So over to you, sir.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Well, when we left off, we were talking about what happened on the 3rd of March 1924, the abolition of the office of the Khilafah, the institution of the Khilafah. And we were looking at the events of that day, the impact it had on Muslims at the time, and some of the trends in ideas and nationalism and secular ideas that had crept their way into the Khilafah in the few decades prior to the abolition, which almost gave a justification to the people at the time who were responsible, Mustafa Kemal and others, that this was an acceptable thing to do. Okay, and we looked at whether or not he was an ideologue, a secular ideologue who was trying to undermine Islam, or whether he was a nationalist who was trying to empower Turkey after a defeat. And honestly, when you look, it's very clear when you look at what he did after the abolition of the Khilafah, that he had some particular idea that he was trying to undo Islam, like when you go about as far as abolishing the Arabic script and abolishing Islamic, so-called Islamic headgear, like fez hats and its headscarves and stuff. It gives you some clue. And how enamored some of these people, some of these thinkers and stuff were about Western ideas, and how they were projecting the experience of Europe, through the French Revolution or the Enlightenment, or even the US experience in their Declaration of Independence, and they seem to be projecting that onto their own experience in the Ottoman Khilafah, which was very different. So we're here for round two, and we are looking at two areas really that are important: internal factors within the Ottoman Khilafah and external pressures.
Right.
So backtrack about 100 years before the fall of the Khilafah and the early part of the 19th century. And actually, Ottomans had faced some unprecedented defeats, particularly in the Crimean War. The Ottoman state was its regional enemy really was Russia, and Russia had tried to encroach on its territory. And Russia was also seen as a threat by the British, a threat to India, and for that reason, the British and other European powers entered the war to support the Ottomans. And over that period of 100 years before the fall of the Khilafah, there was this general sense in the Khilafah that they were falling behind. As we said in our last part, they were a superpower, unparalleled superpower once, and now they were just one of a number of powers in a multipolar world. And that was a big shock to the system. And that was large part due to the Industrial Revolution and Europe's greater ability to arm itself. And that reliance on Western powers like Britain, those rivalries with Russia, led to a lot of debt in the Ottoman Empire. So towards the tail end of the Ottoman Empire, there was an experience of being heavily in debt. And we talked about some separatist movements in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, leading to a loss of territory over the 2-3 decades before the fall of the Khilafah. Bosnia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, Poland, these places which were once under the Ottoman Khilafah, and giving this impression of the sick man of Europe, they were called. So that's the context we're talking about. And in that context, you have a period of time I'd like to talk about, which involves Sultan Abdulaziz, Sultan Abdulhamid, and the Young Turks. In that early period, after the war with Greece, which was settled in a treaty in 1838 called the Treaty of Balta Liman, I think it was. One of the conditions of that treaty by the British was that the Ottomans needed to make more reforms. And most of those were in order to enable Britain to trade more with the Ottoman Khilafah. At the same time, when looking at Europe and how it had changed under these revolutions and their experience, within the Ottoman Khilafah, they were looking at making more reforms as well in terms of administration. So there was a period called the Tanzimat, which is probably needs a blogging theology show on its own, frankly. Yeah.
Thanks for the tip.
It really does. It's a very interesting period and very important period because the two arguments about the Tanzimat are, one, they were necessary reforms. It was about modernizing the administration of the Ottoman Khilafah. And the other side was kind of continuing a theme that I mentioned in part one, which is this is looking at some problems. This is looking at how Europe does things and thinking, hey, you know what? We're going to do it that way. And we're going to tweak it so it's Sharia compliant. Okay. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's said that the Tanzimat were very heavily informed by the Napoleonic Code and the French legal system. Okay. It started in about the late 1830s. So there was a reorganization of the finance system. There was an organization of the civil and criminal code, which is kind of very different because historically in the history of the Khilafah, there is no civil and criminal code as such. The criminal law is the judicial process, and the punishments are all done through the Islamic judicial system and the penal code according to Islam, the hudud and other ta'zir punishments, council of public interaction listed there. Some other things listed there, Ottoman Bank, etc., etc. Topically for 2023, the decriminalization of homosexuality in 1858. I mean, you know, in an Islamic state, which is known to be an Islamic governance that dominates it, its identity is Islam, it's there to uphold Islam. This was in the Tanzimat, okay? So you can see why these things are characterized in these two ways, necessary reforms and trying to copy the West, but and actually it's all signed off by the Shaykh al-Islam. So whatever they did in the Ottoman Khilafah, right till the end, right till those final blows, are justified according to Islam by some fig leaf if it's necessary. Just to kind of give some support to the idea that there's external pressure here, there's a very interesting site called the Office of the Historian of the United States. And you can Google you can search for all kind of terms in there. And if you search for Sultan or Caliph or these kind of things, you get hundreds of entries talking about different things. And this is in 1850 from the Foreign Office by a dispatch from Viscount Palmerston to Sir Stratford Canning, basically commenting on a firman, which is an edict by the Khalifa in favor of Protestants in the Turkish Empire, which has received the sanction of the Sultan. Okay, in fact, below this entry, there's a long list of a text of what the Sultan has said about this. So there's a lot of pressure in Europe at the time on the Khilafah of how to treat, particularly in this case, Protestants, but generally minorities. And this is a theme that will come again. And I guess one of the points linked to some of the ideas coming from Afghani, Abdu, and the other thinkers who were talking about nation state and stuff in the previous episode is reform and revival are two different things. Okay, revival I think of as something which is like going back to principles which lie in Islam, going to your Islam to solve your daily problems and implement in the world today. And reform could mean anything really. And the other lesson really is, what's your change driven by? Is it driven by a desire to please Allah, look after the affairs of your citizens, or just like geopolitical keeping up with the Joneses, or external pressures. So these are important themes to bear in mind, especially when we look at how we relate with politics in the world today, because I see a lot of this nowadays when people are trying to tweak finance and politics to fit in with modern norms. So these reforms are coming in the mid part of the 19th century. Abdulaziz was Sultan in the later part of the 19th century. He's actually the uncle of Sultan Abdul Hamid. As a young man, he visited Europe. Doesn't seem to have been overawed by the European civilization in a political and ideological sense. He was influenced in a cultural sense, certainly. He used to compose music. You can Google Sultan Abdulaziz and listen to some of his compositions.
Oh, really?
They're clearly influenced by European and Arab and Turkish influences. And Abdulaziz had a senior minister called Midhat Pasha. Midhat Pasha wanted to introduce more constitutional reforms. And there is evidence when you read about it that Midhat Pasha was being influenced by the British to introduce more constitutional reforms. And Abdulaziz resisted this. He opposed this. It led to a political struggle, which led to Midhat Pasha and others deposing Abdulaziz in 1876, around about the 30th of May. And on about the 6th of June of that year, he's found with both wrists slashed, dead.
God.
Okay? In an apparent suicide. Although if you slashed one wrist, makes it very hard for you to slash your other wrist.
And you're saying that as a doctor, of course. So that's you know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's not normal for somebody to slash both their wrists. It's not normal, actually, to be honest with you. It's a very unusual thing. But and there's, I don't believe there's any suicide note found. So this leads to speculation that he's been assassinated.
Yeah.
His nephew, I think it is brought in as a successor, Sultan Murad. Murad apparently is already a kind of depressed, anxious young man who, when he's brought into power with rumors of his uncle's assassination, with these big, heavyweight ministers and advisors around him pushing, melts down into almost like a complete breakdown. And within weeks almost, he's deposed as the Khalifa.
Gosh.
The office of the historian, very interestingly, tells us in 1877, the year after Abdulaziz dies, in a dispatch from, I think he's a US diplomat in Istanbul, writing that Midhat Pasha was the ideal of Turkish statesmanship, a reformer and a true patriot. He's been a prime favorite with the British embassy and relied upon to circumvent and bring to naught the machinations imputed to Russia. So I guess maybe the British at the time are worried that the Ottoman Khilafah will have people influencing from other places, from Russia or from France. And remember what we said before, for the British in this era, India is everything, right? If you lose the Ottoman Khilafah, you open a gateway for Russia intoDia.
But just to stress, the reason why India is so important to the British is because of the great wealth and trade and prestige.
Absolutely.
It brings to the mother country. So it's not because they care for India, it's because of the
No. Yeah. No, the East India Company had gone to India with its private army taking it over, and eventually all the wealth was flowing back to Britain. The city of London was built upon that wealth. All of Britain's advantage in the world was built on that wealth. politicians and the aristocracy were all shareholders in that wealth. And so that everything is about trying to keep the Mediterranean. It's crucial that they keep the Mediterranean friendly to them. Strategically, the Ottoman state is very important. Later, when the Germans have a very good alliance with the Ottomans, they help build a railroad in there. Now imagine a railroad linking Germany right across Asia through to India becomes extremely dangerous for the British. So a lot of this is about India. But you can see that Midhat Pasha, it's clear he has enjoyed a very strong diplomatic relationship, which supports the idea that he was at odds with Abdulaziz. Lesson 11, beware of the potential for foreign agents in the administration of the Khilafah. And I say this without any shame, that sadly, when you look at the administrations of so many Muslim countries around the world today, and you see the relations between those politicians and foreign powers, you see that they're not ruling in the interests of people of their country, they're ruling in somebody else's interest. So this young man finds himself appointed as Khalifa when he's not really expecting it. He's around, I think, 34. I think this photograph is taken when he's much younger. Sultan Abdul Hamid. He's quite close to his uncle. He accompanied him on a trip to Europe as well. But he inherits a pretty bad hand. He inherits an empire under great pressures internally. He inherits some of the discussions about reform and secularization and nationalism, some of them, particularly in the Balkans. He inherits a massive amount of debt. And you know, he inherits a pretty unstable situation because you've just lost two Khalifas in a very short period of time, and over probably what is a dispute. Initially, he goes along with the constitutionalists. He calls for a constitutional to be written. And you know, a lot of people, when they talk about this nowadays, they might be thinking, well, what's wrong with that? You know, having a constitution, you know, that seems perfectly sensible. But, you know, we're talking about 1876 when he comes into power. And that's, you know, like, when was the Declaration of Independence? It's 1776, isn't it?
Yeah, 1776.
So America only had a constitution 100 years before, and France only gets its constitution less than 100 years before. And Britain to this day doesn't have a written constitution. So having a written constitution, which you can understand why, and I'm not against written constitution per se, but having a written constitution is not something which is kind of like a must-have in every political system, and it certainly wasn't in the history of Islam. But Abdul Hamid agrees to that. But bear in mind, he is governing over a very unstable situation. He has got the rise of secularists. Midhat Pasha was part of a group called the Young Ottomans, not the Young Turks, the Young Ottomans. So they were influenced by reformist ideas, and they're now in positions of political power. So he's got internal threats, internal instability. Pretty soon he has to deal with a crisis in the Balkans, where he's got to deal with factions there. He's got Armenians that are going to play out in the coming years of his reign. And any student of politics will know that politics demands that rulers can make decisions, and sometimes fast and sometimes effectively. Even in the US Constitution, the president might have to go to Congress to approve his budget, but he doesn't have to go to Congress to approve war, to defend the country, to deal with really quite serious crises, right? And some people who are critical of the American system, praise it for its separation of powers, will also criticize it for the fact that it's a bit cumbersome with its separation of powers. So Abdul Hamid has got this new constitutional system which has never existed in the history of the Ottoman Khilafah or any other Khilafah before, where he has a written constitution, and he's expected to deal with all these crises. in an empire of debt. And it's the reason I've shared this quote from Otto von Bismarck, one of Europe's greatest statesmen of the time, saying that if wisdom is 100 grams, I'm not sure he said 100 grams because I don't think they probably would have had the metric system there, but I don't know when it was introduced. But if wisdom was 100 grams, Abdul Hamid has 90 of it. He has 5, and the rest of leaders and politicians have the remaining 5 grams. And Bismarck is considered by European politicians as undoubtedly one of the greatest statesmen in European history. I mean, even his enemies rate him. Okay, so this is quite a statement to make. And in fact, Abdul Hamid somehow manages to steer through the next 30 plus years with this very bad hand he's built out. Improve administration considerably, improve finances considerably. And even when he has to quell rebellion in a very harsh way, and people criticize him for being an autocrat, and he's got a political opposition like no previous Khalifa has had, right? No previous Khalifa has had factions like this, except, going back well, that's perhaps an exaggeration. There have been political oppositions in the past, and I'd backtrack on that. But no Ottoman Khalifa has had political opposition like this. And still, by the end of his term, or towards the end of this term, he's a respected ruler. He's a respected leader. So he must have been doing something right in that era. And in Europe, he's caricatured as, I've got some slides later on, he's caricatured as the Red Sultan, red because he's got blood on his hands. And I'll explain why some of those things later, but it is about crushing separatism more than anything else. He's caricatured as being paranoid. Well, he had an assassination. He had his first assassination attempt made on his life by external opposition in the very first few years or months of his term as Khalifa. So he had opposition groups which were linked to foreign powers in his administration, in his family even. One of his nephews, Prince Sabatain, was an ardent secularist who even fled from the Khilafah and went overseas. So this is what this guy is dealing with. And at the same time, he's resisting entreaties from Zionists to settle the entire Ottoman debt just to give Palestine. And he won't give that up because he says this is not his to give up. He won't give up Al-Masjid al-Aqsa because he's the Khalifa who's a custodian over these places, not the owner of these places. So very aware of what's going on about the political machinations around the world. But in 1908, he is deposed by the Young Turks, also known as the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress.
So why are they called, just to clarify, why are they called the Young Turks? Is a very distinctive title, isn't it?
Yeah. So they are Ottomans. They are Muslims. They are not seeking to abolish the Khilafah, but they are seeking reforms. And they want constitutional government. They've opposed Abdul Hamid suspending the constitution after about a year and a half in his early part of his term as Khalifa. And through pressures they put on later on, Abdul Hamid reinstated the constitution quite late in his term. And the Ottoman Khilafah has been facing all these different schisms from minorities and realizes that Ottomanism, because an Albanian or a Bulgarian or a Serbian or a Bosnian or a Kurd or an Arab from Syria or an Arab from the Hijaz were all Ottoman, as well as the Turks. That this Ottoman citizen identity was not glue that was working properly. So a lot of the debates at the time were about how you bond the society together. Abdul Hamid's answer to it was you bond around Islam, because that is in essence our core, our our system is Khilafah. Our majority people are Muslim. If that's the bond you bond around first, other people will fall into line. But also there is a bond to other Muslims around the world. And he spent a lot of time building relations with Muslims in India and Malaysia and other parts of the Ottoman Khilafah, and Britain as well, as we've said before, and America. Alexander Muhammad Webb was the Ottoman I think consul to America, appointed in the time of Abdul Hamid. So cultivating relationships with Muslims around the world. The Young Turks were affected by the nationalism. So they were affected. They were young Ottomans who had been, some of them had visited places like Syria, and they'd heard Ottoman Arab Syrians speaking in an Arab nationalist way, affected by some of these ideas that we talked about in part one. And they didn't like that. So their default reaction was to kind of think about a more Turkish kind of bond within the Turkic regions of and that being said, they also had pan-Islamic ideas. They also were very interested in defending Libya from invasion by the Italians and many other, trying to keep their relationship with Egypt, etc., etc. So there were many things about them that were trying to do with pan-Islamism, but that's a Western term. Sorry about that, but you get the point. That I think when I read around it, I see this tension between their Turkish nationalism and their desire to implement Islam. Young Turks become a bit pejorative as well. It's almost like young people taking over, driving the car recklessly. And they did have a bit of that about them. And a lot of the criticism about them entering First World War was that the Ottoman Khilafah didn't have to pick a side. The First World War was predominantly about the rise of Germany in Europe, and Britain, France, and Russia and Italy trying to keep Germany in check. And by this stage, as we will come to discuss later, the British had changed their policy on the Ottomans in the late 19th century and really turned hostile to them. And at that stage, the Ottomans had built a better relation with the Germans. And that's why Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm had good relations with Abdul Hamid. And as a result, the Ottomans had very good relations with Germany. And the Young Turks had hoped to build better relations with Britain. In fact, they'd commissioned Britain to build some warships. Churchill had approved that. And then at the time that war had broken out, Churchill withheld the warships, which effectively meant the Ottoman Khilafah had to choose, do they just accept that humiliation, or do they come into the war on the side of Germany? There's some reports that almost suggest the British gave them an ultimatum saying, well, neutrality isn't an option. In fact, there was a delay between when war broke out with Germany and war was declared with the Ottomans, because the Ottomans did think about staying neutral. So it is possible that had the British not done that move, the Ottomans would have tried to stay neutral. But, Abdul Hamid was criticized often for being too diplomatic and not confronting his enemies from other world powers sufficiently. And the counter of that is diplomacy is just a tool in warfare, and it's a tool that means less loss of blood, it means less loss of life, and it's less costly when you're in debt and wars take money to fight. So perhaps Abdul Hamid, with his political acumen and political wisdom, was steering the Ottoman Khilafah through a period where it needed to avoid conflict so it could get more independent. But World War I breaks out. and the Ottomans are in the game on in the what they call with the Axis powers, and the Khalifa, the Ottoman, the Young Turk government, basically the government, the Khalifa who succeeded, I think he's Mehmed V, I think, is the one who succeeded Abdul Hamid, is more of a figurehead, more of a constitutional Khalifa rather than an actual governor. And the Young Turks get the Sheikh al-Islam to go to the Fatih Mosque in Istanbul, beautiful masjid, and read a fatwa of jihad against the allied powers of Europe. So the Ottoman army that's mobilized with its tanks, its planes, its professional soldiers, its artillery, is the last army of jihad we've really seen and declared in a proper way. So they held out better than anyone could have expected at the outset of the war. I think nobody would have expected them to still be in the game by 1918. And in fact, the war in the Ottoman territories went on longer than in Europe, because even when officially the war had ended in Europe, there were wars. There was still the war effectively being fought in Turkey and elsewhere. You can say that really that ended with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. Lesson 12 with this, I think, is pan-Islamic bonds, i.e. unity of the Ummah. It must always be sincerely for Islam. There's a criticism of Abdul Hamid and the Young Turks that they were pragmatic or opportunistic and using their Islam. I don't get that sense with Abdul Hamid. You get the sense when you read about him of a sincere and devout person. And there isn't really this conflict with the Young Turks who have got this Turkish identity. At the same time, they are looking to use the pan-Islamic identity of the Ummah as soft power, you can say, in diplomatic terms. Yeah. So, and nationalistic bonds, they're haram and they never deliver. So it's just an important lesson at this time to remember. So these are kind of some very important internal factors. Is that all right, Paul?
Yeah, that's fine so far. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. So I'm a bit worried that when I've been preparing this, that a lot of these different streams are parallel to each other. So the change in ideas, the internal factors, the external factors, the rise of the Young Turks and then Mustafa Kemal, the changing British foreign policy, etc. They're all happening at the same time. So try and unpick this.
Very complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated. So we've got external forces we're going to look at now. It's worth starting with the relationship of the Khilafah and the West. So, I mean, you can't overlook the Crusades. There's a beautiful painting of Jerusalem taken from the Mount of Olives. This is the approach that everyone seems to have to Jerusalem. It's the approach that Umar al-Khattab saw when he first approached Jerusalem, because the mountain Jabal Mukabbar, which he entered the region from, overlooks Jerusalem from the same perspective. And Salahuddin entered Jerusalem from this perspective as well. So the Crusades were about retaking the Holy Land, and obviously that defines a lot of the relationship of the Khilafah with Europe, with the West. And the fall of Granada and the fact that Islam was a European power going back to the early part of the Umayyad Khilafah. In fact, Cyprus came under Islam, I think, during the time of the Khilafah Rashida and Uthman bin Affan, radiallahu anhu. But by 1492, Islam is expelled from Southern Europe in the fall of Granada. And then another milestone in Europe's history with Islam is the Siege of Vienna. So Suleiman Qanuni, Suleiman the Magnificent, his armies his armies are at the gates of Vienna, which
Right.
is a term, for those who aren't familiar, which is a term that it is a very emotive term, which kind of makes Europe feel that, Vienna is, of course, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire at this time. So one of the greatest empires in Europe. So literally, these are what Europe's, and all of this has defined Europe's relationship with the Khilafah. And then Napoleon invades in the early part of the 19th century in Europe and is there for a little while. The British come in afterwards, in Egypt, sorry. One nice aspect of the Khilafah's relationship with the West is a really lovely example, which I don't know if your audience has heard of, is in the terrible Irish famine caused by potato blight in the 1840s. And the worst year apparently was 1847. And Sultan Abdul Majid I offered to send a huge amount of money to help the Irish, but was refused by the British because Queen Victoria hadn't donated that much. The Irish were constantly in rebellion, and to help them in the famine was seen as being too kind to them. So giving them just enough help to keep them weak was the policy over here. So the Sultan gifted less, but for diplomatic reasons. But he then sent some ships over with food in secret to help the people. And to this day, people in Ireland remember this act of generosity from the Ottomans. And I think that's a lovely story. In fact, it's not a lesson I've put down, but a lesson for us is that when you as a Muslim want to see your Islam helping people around the world who are suffering, it's only ever really going to happen on a large scale when you have a political authority that is willing to devote resources to that. What a political authority can do in terms of mobilizing ships and stuff like that in those days, 100,000 individuals wouldn't be able to do. So it's a good lesson, I think, and a beautiful story and a beautiful example of the Khilafah's relationship with the West. So actually, Britain has quite an interesting history with the Khilafah because it was often in conflict with the rest of Europe from the time of Henry VIII onwards because of the religious conflicts. And so there is evidence that in Tudor times, there was quite a lot of interest in the Ottoman Khilafah. It's said that Henry VIII was very interested in Suleiman, but also Elizabeth I, her minister, Francis Walsingham, who was the head of their intelligence service. It is said that he had tried to recruit Ottoman help in the battle against the Spanish. So Britain didn't have always a terrible history with the Ottoman Khilafah. But come back to the beginning of the 19th century, you've got this age of empires. Okay, so you've got a declining Ottoman state, Britain, Russia, Austro-Hungarian Empire, a change in British policy because of what we've talked about, India and the fear from Russia. Over this time, they developed quite a good relationship with the Ottoman Khilafah, hoping to see the Ottomans as a buffer, a strategic buffer against Russia for the sake of India and the Mediterranean. And then something changes in around 1876. And this is a very interesting picture of the Congress of Berlin. I think it's in 1880 something. I can't remember. But this has got Bismarck in the center. This has got Disraeli on our left. And on the right-hand side, you can see these European statesmen wearing fezes, who are the Ottomans. Gives you some picture of where the Ottoman Khilafah stood in international relations terms in those days. Okay, Congress of Berlin. Okay, and then there's this change in British policy. The problem I've got is in my notes. Hang on, I've got somewhere in my notes. I've got the years of these things, but it doesn't show on the. So here we are. Change in British policy. Okay, so there's this pamphlet written by Gladstone, Britain's Prime Minister Gladstone, who, after some bloodshed in Bulgaria, and there's a podcast I listened to recently which was explaining that the bloodshed started because the Russians incited Christians in Bulgaria to start attacking Muslim villages, and the response back was a very brutal, very harsh response back from the Ottoman state on that Christian minority. On that Christian minority, meaning minority in the whole of the Ottoman state, but actually probably a majority in the region of which is now Bulgaria. And in Europe, Western Europe, this is seen as these Turks who are attacking our Christian brothers, oppressing minorities, spilling blood. In that podcast, which was contributed to by a guy whose book I would recommend, called The Fall of the Ottomans by Professor Eugene Rogan. It's a good book. It's an interesting book, and it's very good on the military aspects and in the tail end of the Ottoman Khilafah, called The Fall of the Ottomans. Eugene Rogan mentions in that podcast that, look, nobody mentions about the Muslim villages where people were killed and blood was spilled. And in fact, in Turkey, this is often mentioned today. That how come nobody mentions this anymore? That's what this all started from. Nonetheless, Gladstone picks up on this, and in a very powerful pamphlet, he denounces the Ottomans. And you get this revert to type from Britain about the East, the Muslims, the Mohammedans, barbaric, backward, bloodthirsty, oppressing minorities, which is actually all untrue. Even the oppressing minorities, I mean, this is the same era that Britain is oppressing oppressing the whole of India and many other colonies. Okay, this is Britain and its relationship with Catholics since the time of the English Reformation hasn't really been great. So, this is I hate to say it, this is like basically Islamophobia on a state level, basically. And Disraeli, Gladstone, rival statesmen of their era, political enemies. Disraeli, a pragmatist, thinking about how he's going to deal with all the different affairs and dealing with the Ottomans in a certain way. Gladstone, a Whig, very, think Tony Blair, but 100 years before. Yeah, think that kind of liberal statesman who really wants to impose values on the rest of the world. Britain's foreign policy, Britain's public opinion really changes towards the Khilafah in that period. And Palmerston famously said, a statesman of that era, foreign policy leader of that era, Britain has no eternal allies, no permanent enemies. Our interests are eternal, and it is those interests that it's our duty to follow. So Britain's policy interests have changed at this period. It's no longer going to try and support the Ottoman Khilafah. It's looking at other ways of dealing with its situation with Russia, particularly Greece, and it's got other ideas in Egypt, etc., etc. So Britain's policy has changed. And it changes from support to undermining it diplomatically, politically, inciting some of the dissent, having more agents or how I could say supporters within the administration, and then eventually declaring war, inciting the Arab revolt, dividing the land up with France before the end of the First World War under the Sykes-Picot Treaty, which effectively carved up the whole of the Ottoman Khilafah, and in some places, like Palestine, putting in direct occupation and other places having their proxy rulers in there. And then really aiming to destroy the power of the Ottoman Khilafah through the treaties of Sèvres and later through the Treaty of Lausanne. And we'll look at some of these. And these are kind of the caricatures of Abdul Hamid in particular that the British press had, and the European press in general had in those days. So very racialized, very mocking, and very, caricaturing, really, isn't it? So we get to a point in the era of the war, and we talked about World War One to some extent in the previous part where we talked about the Arab Revolt, where we've got to think about three tracks happening all at once. World War One has ended. You have Treaty of Versailles in Europe, and then the Treaty of Sèvres related to the Ottoman Khilafah. And that is not something that they're able to implement. So after a couple of years, you have the Lausanne Conference and eventually a Treaty of Lausanne, which settles the peace with the Ottoman Khilafah. This is one diplomatic track that we have to understand. At the same time, related to this, there's a war breaks out between Greece and Turkey. When the Allies defeat the Ottomans, British troops occupy Istanbul. Throughout the war, it had been Russia that had its eyes on Constantinople. It was Russia saw itself as the upholder of the Orthodox Church. Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, was seen as, or I think they call it Hagia Sophia, was seen as like the most important city in Christendom, in Orthodox Christendom, and Russia had their eye on that. Yet during the First World War, there was the Russian Revolution in 1917, and the communists didn't really want to have their eye on a cathedral and a city associated with Christianity. So it fell to the British to occupy Istanbul and other of the Allied powers to occupy other regions. And Thessalonica was occupied by the Greek soldiers. And this is like a red rag to the bull to the Turks. You know, to be occupied by the Greeks was unacceptable. So a war breaks out between the Greeks and the Turks. And this goes on for a year or two. And in that war, Mustafa Kemal plays a key part and is seen as the hero, the nationalist hero who resists the occupation. And all this time that he's resisting these occupiers, which is great, he's denouncing the government in Istanbul, the government of the Khalifa, as having capitulated, having sold out to the British, as being British agents. And so he, over this time, he sets up another center in Ankara, another government. So you have two governments in what is then Ottoman Turkey. But it strengthens his negotiating hand against the Allies, because the Treaty of Sèvres it's actually available to read online. I wish I'd copied and pasted some of the bits. I've got them on my Facebook page, actually. I shared them a couple of times. It's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. You read it, it's literally taking all these provinces of the Ottoman Khilafah, Syria, Palestine, Hijaz, Cyprus, and it's literally, it's carving them up. It's dismembering the Ottoman Khilafah in a way that I think probably no peace treaty in history has literally done. And it's sharing the spoils out with France in particular. And so Mustafa Kemal, by leading the war against Greece, strengthens his negotiating hand. That's how it's looked at by others. That's why so many people respected him. And at the same time, you have the rise of the nationalists and Mustafa Kemal and his people in the Ottoman Khilafah, which we talked about in the first part of this. So these all are happening at the same time. And in addition to that, Britain's got to keep its eye on France. and got to keep its eye on Russia, and it's got to keep its eye on the Muslims of India, because they're watching all of this and they aren't happy. They aren't happy because they see it as a threat to the Khilafah. They see this as a war on Islam, and we'll see some of this later. The Sèvres Treaty, which is dismembering the Khilafah, Lloyd George celebrated that Turkey is no more. And David Fromkin, in another excellent book I would recommend called A Peace to End All Peace, says that this treaty is for nothing less than reducing the Ottoman state to almost a non-entity. And as I say, the Khalifa and his administration are portrayed as having sold out, but they've got an occupying force in Istanbul. They've lost the war. The young Turks have been either exiled or locked up because they've been accused of war crimes. So they're left to pick up the pieces, the new administration in Istanbul, but they're portrayed as having sold out. And all of that is exploited by Mustafa Kemal in his bid for leadership. And so again, in the Greek-Turkish War, very interesting. Initially, there was actually a difference of opinion in the British administration. To start off with, they were all backing the Greeks, okay, because this was so soon after 1918 that it was seen as almost like a continuation of World War I. The war hadn't ended in Central and Eastern Europe, okay, so Lloyd George was backing the Greeks from a civilizational perspective. He was really anti-Muslim. All right. There's a book I think you and I know, Paul, A Line in the Sand by James Barr.
Yes. So
here's one you had.
This, yes, I have it to hand. This one. There we go. A Line in the Sand. Spain, France. Britain, France, and the struggle that shaped the Middle East. James Barr, highly recommended by scholars and others on the back. So that's worth reading. Yep.
It is worth reading because it talks about things like the Sykes-Picot Accord, where the land is basically divided up between Sir Mark Sykes, British diplomat, and Georges Picot, French diplomat. It talks about the Balfour Declaration and the decisions to try and carve out Palestine, and both the French wanting it and the British wanting it. It talks about the Lloyd George, Churchill, Balfour, Sykes, Kitchener, and others from intimate documentation which shows their attitudes towards the Muslim world. And really, Lloyd George really doesn't like Islam at all. He's somebody who sees it in civilizational terms. Greece beating Ottoman Turkey would be the liberal dream of a triumphant Hellenism and Christianity. But as the war goes on, there's a difference in the cabinet. And this is Britain's interests playing out. Lloyd George has got this idea: we've got to support Greece. Others like Curzon, Lord Curzon, Marquis Curzon of Kedleston, former Viceroy of India and real foreign policy guru at this time, says no, actually, Turkey, Ottoman Turkey, a rump Turkey, still offers our best protection and for our interests in the region. And midway through this war, Lord George has gone. A new government takes over. I think it's Austen Chamberlain takes over as Prime Minister. Could be wrong though. Yeah, I think it's Austen Chamberlain takes over as Prime Minister. And actually, Britain kind of withdraws its support from the Greeks after having kind of like backed them some of the way. Kind of like the Americans did with the Afghani government until a couple of years back. They kind of pulled the plug on them. And that effectively allows Mustafa Kemal to lead to a victory, which, as I say, makes him even more of a hero. And this kind of feeds into the opinion that maybe the British were trying to empower Kemal. There's a lot when you read the history written from the Western perspective that would say that the West was anti-Kemal. Okay, there's a lot. And if you read it from a Kemalist history perspective, they'll all say Kemal was anti-West. I said before, there's a bit of history missing here, which is the Ottoman history, which was not pro-Kemalist. And there is a view out there that this is one of the examples of how Kemal was being empowered. And there's another view about this when it comes to the Lausanne Conference of 1922 being called, because in a very unusual way, the British who occupied Istanbul, who have direct communication with the Istanbul government, invite both Istanbul representatives and Ankara representatives, this revolutionary government in Ankara, to attend the Lausanne peace talks. Now, some people would say this is geopolitics. They have to sort out the peace. They have to get all factions there. Others would say, well, actually, basically what you've done is you've recognized this revolutionary government, and by giving them recognition, you've empowered them. And whatever the intention was, it did empower them, because this is in 1922. And if you remember in our first part, we said in October 1922, the Kemalists abolished the Sultanate. So they expelled the then Khalifa, the Sultan Mehmet. They expel him from Istanbul. He flees, and the powers of the Sultan go to the Grand National Assembly in Ankara, and the Khalifa is a figurehead, religious figure in Istanbul. So that's how these events kind of tie together. One reference I can find in academic work, but it's an opinion held by many, that the Lausanne negotiations explicitly call for adopting Western governmental and administrative standards. I'll be honest, I've done a lot of research on Western history books that go through the negotiations at Lausanne. It doesn't really go into this. It doesn't. But this one very interesting book, Islam and the Politics of Secularism, the Caliphate in the Middle East, by Nurullah Ardich, mentions this. And he goes on to mention Article 27 of the eventual Lausanne Treaty, okay? And I think this is important. And this is, I'm really desperately trying not to be conspiratorial about this, okay? So this, what I've said about Lausanne shows that whatever the intention, Kemal is empowered. And Ardich is saying that there's something explicit about changing the nature of the future Turkey, making it less Islamic, okay? The official histories don't go into that, except when you get to this article, which says no power or jurisdiction in political, legislative, or administrative matters shall be exercised outside Turkish territory by the Turkish government or authorities for any reason whatsoever over the nationals of a territory placed under sovereignty or protectorate of the other powers signatory of the present treaty, or over the nationals of a territory detached from Turkey. All right. So the signatories of this treaty are going to include, the nationalists in the East, in Ankara. The signatories of this treaty are going to include, this treaty is going to cover Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, Egypt, Hijaz, all the former Ottoman territories, except what's under the Istanbul administration, right? And it says it is understood that the spiritual attributions of the Muslim religious authorities are in no way infringed. This is an olive branch to the Muslims in India. This is to show the Muslims in India that they are not anti-Islam, they are just anti the Ottoman Empire, all right, as a power, all right? But effectively, this article, once it's signed, says the Khalifa has no political power outside of what is under the Istanbul center. Anything that's covered by Ankara and anything outside in the former Ottoman territories, there's no power of Islam there anymore. Mm-hmm. Okay, that was in the actual legal treaty in the end of it. In fact, this is an earlier draft which I found somewhere else, which was being discussed. It's too much detail, I think. All right. The British were looking for an alternative spiritual caliph, a spiritual only caliph, I should say. Okay. There are many detailed, documented correspondence between different British diplomats, which show that they were looking for an alternative to the current setup of the Khilafah. So on the table were multiple Khalifas. So you have the one in Istanbul, you've got an Arab Khalifa, maybe Sharif Hussein in Mecca. You have some in North Africa whose names are put forward. You have even the leadership of the Agha Khan over the Ismailis and the Ghulam Mirza Ahmad as the Khalifa over the Ahmadis, Qadianis, is like mentioned in some of these papers. And even the idea of trying to destroy the Khilafah in Istanbul, but relocating it to Mecca under Sharif Hussein, all of this is touted. And this is from an India Office handbook penned in 1919. And it makes the point that, look, from the history of the Khilafah, all the utterances of present-day authorities on Muhammadan law and tradition, from the history of the Khilafah and all the Sharia, basically, it doesn't appear that the Khilafah can be regarded as a spiritual domain only, right? It's always had spiritual and temporal power, okay? So for those people who are kind of questioning that, 1919, confidential, behind the scenes, British Foreign Office, India Office handbook advice is, you can't do this. The idea of having a spiritual caliph is not going to work. The caliph will always be seen as political by some people. Okay. Interesting paper, that. And the same handbook actually also makes the point, after the defeat of the Ottomans, that it may become clear that caliphate as an institution is as dead as the Holy Roman Empire. Vox et praeterea nihil, a voice but no substance. I had to Google that to get the translation. I don't know Latin. But basically, their opinion is that, you know what, you've got this idea of getting Sharif Hussein as a caliph, but frankly speaking, we don't think it's the Khilafah is going to last for long. Actually, the Secretary of State from India is a very interesting diplomat called Edwin Montagu. And he wrote numerous letters to Lloyd George complaining that the tone of the British response to the post-war period was very anti-Muslim, very anti-Islam. And you are just creating a problem in India that actually all these Indian Muslims who are looking for independence in India and looking to remove the British influence in India are showing what you're doing in the Ottoman Khilafah as being anti-Islam, and this is a problem. And Lloyd George actually is documented, gets fed up with these. Montagu is very interesting because, side point, he's one of the only English Jews in the administration. And when the Balfour Declaration is being touted in cabinet, behind closed doors, should we make this promise, this pledge to Lord Rothschild, representing the Zionist interest, that should Britain win the war, it will give Palestine, the Jewish people, a homeland in Palestine. And there's big discussion to be had about that, but obviously finance is something to do with it. But also the attracting the Jewish lobby in America to try and get America to enter the war is something to do with it. But Britain does this in the Balfour Declaration. It's being debated amongst Kitchener, Sykes, Balfour, Lloyd George, Churchill in private, and Montagu, right? It's being debated amongst all of them. Montagu's view is we must not sign it. Basically, you will be saying to all Jews around the world, including English Jews, go home to your homeland in Palestine. And this was alienating to English Jews. And it's a very interesting guy in this respect that's worth reading into if anyone's interested. So this debate goes on. Should we have an Arab caliph or no caliph? Caliph, I should say, or Khalifa. Curzon writing to Cromer in a private correspondence, he says, look, we're not in Constantinople. And even if we could replace the caliph there, there's no guarantee that the Muslims would accept it. So this is the debate that's going on behind closed doors at the same time as these peace conferences and these treaties, and at the same time that Mustafa Kemal is rising in power in the post-war Ottoman state. Jonathan Lawrence, in a very interesting book, which I'll put in the references, I've forgotten the name of it now, but really interesting chapter on the fall of the Khilafah, mentions that Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, he was actually trying to get support for himself as a new Khalifa when the abolition happened on the 3rd of March of 1924. And he actually even falsely claimed that the Kurdish government would support him. On the 5th of March, he formally declared himself the Khalifa. And his son was celebrating that the caliphate has come back to the Arabs, and the Turks had given a great service to the Arabs, and he felt like sending a telegram thanking Mustafa Kemal for that. So this is what these kind of people were like, basically. But despite that, the British observers there didn't think it would sell, actually. There was a journalist out there who was reporting back that there were plenty of Muslims who were unhappy about it. There were plenty of Muslims in the Arab lands that were once part of the Khilafah who felt this deep humiliation, this loyalty to Abdul Majid, even as the spiritual Khalifa. And you know, this talk of the caliphate back to Arabia and stuff, it was there from some people, but not by no means by all. And I'm sorry about the small print here, but in some correspondence between the advisors to the British, including Gertrude Bell, who was an intelligence officer based in the Middle East, who traveled widely, who had deep connections with these people, with Sharif Hussein, with her son Faisal, and you know, she was writing back to London. You know what? Sharif Hussein's a non-starter on this. And this is the same Gertrude Bell who, less than a decade later, was writing back to London saying, Sharif Hussein's son Faisal is a guy we can back. Yeah, so she has some understanding of the region, and she's just saying, you know what, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud is a better bet to occupy the Hijaz and Najd than Sharif Hussein. And in fact, that is eventually what happened. This is in the same period. Gertrude Bell wrote letters published by The Spectator when Sharif Hussein's son Faisal was installed as the king of Iraq. And this description in her letters that these two Arab tribal leaders, Fahad and Ali Suleiman, stood up on either side of him, and the only way they could give their allegiance to Faisal was to say, we swear allegiance to you because you are acceptable to the British government. Imagine this Pledge of Allegiance that actually says that in it. Faisal was a little surprised, Gertrude Bell says, but looked quickly round to me smiling, and then he said, no one can doubt what my relations are to the British, but we must settle our affairs ourselves, i.e. I don't want to be seen as a British stooge. He looked at me again, and I held out my two hands clasped together as a symbol of union between the Arab people and the British government.
Amazing.
So this is an amazing description of how these proxy leaders were installed to rule over the Middle East over the next few decades. This diplomat, Harold Nicholson, also reinforces the idea that that Curzon had no intention of dealing gently with the Turks. They had voluntarily aided Germany. They treated our prisoners harshly. They massacred our troops. Therefore, they deserved the fate which was inflicted upon them. And Nicholson quotes Curzon saying, for 5 centuries, he says, the presence of the Turk in Europe has been a source of distraction, intrigue, corruption in European politics, of oppression and misrule to the subject nationalities. I mean, this is such a skewed version of the Turks in Europe. It's unbelievable, because many historians, Western historians, will describe how the Ottomans managed to govern over this hugely diverse empire in a way that others didn't manage to. So this just shows the prejudices coming out. And all of that, Paul, is what leads to the events that Mustafa Kemal assumes power, abolishes the Sultanate, abolishes the Ottoman state altogether in November 1922, declaring a Turkish Republic, and then ultimately abolishes the office of the Khilafah and the institution on the 3rd of March 1924. And the rest, as they say, is history, and a terrible history at that, in the Middle East and beyond. In fact, one leading Indian Muslim politician wrote to the Times in the week after the abolition of the Khilafah, saying, I believe this will be a great tragedy for civilization. He didn't just say for Muslims and for Islam, but for civilization. And, you know, when people look at the wrongs, whether in Palestine or the wrongs that have come out of the Iraq war, the wrongs that have come out in Syria being destabilized, the wrongs that have come out from these tyrants and oppressors like the Assads and the Gaddafis and the Baathists and the Saddam Husseins, and it stems back to these events. But there's a silver lining. I wanted to just end on the silver lining.
Okay.
If that's all right.
Please.
And last time we ended on the ayah of Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises the return of the Khilafah to those who believe and do good deeds and don't associate partners with Allah. And we have the promise of Allah's Messenger. And we have the promise of 2 things. The first is a hadith in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. And the hadith is mentioned here and in the translation. The Prophet ﷺ describes ruling over the Muslims in different stages, according to what Allah wills. So the first is prophethood, which was with us when he ﷺ was with us. And then Khilafah ala minhaj al-nubuwah, on the method of prophethood. That was the first 4 khulafa. And then a kind of hereditary rule. And that was Khilafah because it fulfilled the conditions of Khilafah, and that was under the Umayyads and the Abbasids and the Ottomans, all the Uthmanis. All of these were examples. They fulfilled the conditions of Khilafah, but they corrupted the process. They corrupted the Bay'ah process, whereby the Khilafah Rashida, the rightly guided Khulafa, they took their Bay'ah from the people of authority on representing the masses, sometimes directly from the people, but if not, then from people representing the authority of the people, the Ahlul Hal wal Aqd are called. The Umayyads, the Abbasids, and the Ottomans, they kept their bay'ah within their ruling family. So it would go from father to son, or from ruler to son, or from ruler to brother, or to nephew. It stayed within the family, often to the person they thought was the most suitable, rather than the direct heir. It's a khilafah, but it's a corruption of the khilafah. And then the Prophet ﷺ described an oppressive rule, a biting rule, and that would last for as long as Allah wills. And then he said, ﷺ, that there will be khilafah on the method of prophethood again. Thumma sakat. Then he was silent. Okay, so basically we have another khilafah to come. And that khilafah, the Prophet ﷺ also told us that this matter, khilafah, will continue after me in Medina, which it did, and then move to Asham, which it did, because the capital of khilafah was in Damascus, and then to the peninsula. Well, if you include Iraq, broadly speaking, close to the Arabian Peninsula, it was in Baghdad, and it was in Iraq. Then to Bayt al-Maqdis, or then to the city meaning the city of Heraclius, Constantinople, which it did. The seat of the Khilafah was in Constantinople. And then to Bayt al-Maqdis, Jerusalem. And to this day, the capital of the Khilafah has never been in Jerusalem. Jerusalem has not yet been the capital of the Khilafah. So this is a good news from the Prophet ﷺ, that in the future, the Khilafah will be re-established. It will be a Khilafah on the method of prophethood, i.e. righteously guided, the most just, best example of Khilafah according to Islam. It will come as that form of Khilafah in the future, and its capital city will be Jerusalem, mashallah.
Wow, that's quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary. Well, that's certainly a silver lining, I must say, after all that extraordinary history. So thank you very much, Dr. Abdul Wahid, for your extraordinary survey on the history of the issues over the centuries. Much food for thought there, much to digest. And we'll put the links in the description below to the items that you've mentioned for further reading. So thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.